narcissist wants you to believe they feel nothing at all when you leave, that your absence hasn't impacted them, that they're doing just fine, maybe even better off without you. They want to convince you that you were never particularly special, just another person who passed through their life like many others. And they'll go to great lengths to cement this illusion, using everything from cold silence to feigned indifference, to carefully curated snapshots of a seemingly blissful life displayed for the world to see. But don't be misled, because once you truly walk away and don't glance back, something begins to fracture inside them, a breakdown that's silent, intense, and irreversible. Here's the truth. When you leave a narcissist, you don't just exit their life, you take with you the mirror they rely on to survive. Without your attention, your emotional reactions, or your admiration, they lose the very foundation they use to construct their sense of identity. And for someone with a narcissistic mind, that's more than painful. It's a full-blown identity crisis. The moment you make a solid break, every control tactic they once used to manipulate you starts to disintegrate. They can't reel you back in with insincere apologies. They can't provoke guilt with their silence. They can't cast blame or slip into the role of the victim anymore. And it's exactly in that stillness, when you stop responding and refuse to be pulled back in, that they begin to recognize something terrifying. They've truly lost control. At first, it won't show. You won't witness a dramatic meltdown, no tearful pleas or emotional theatrics. Narcissists don't fall apart in loud explosions. They fracture in silence, layer by layer. It begins with denial. Then it shifts into anger. And finally, it settles into panic. They try to replace you quickly, scrambling to rebuild the illusion of their ego. But when that fresh supply fails to satisfy, when the emptiness remains, they descend into a quiet internal crisis. They're left to confront the very thing they've always feared most, that nobody believes in the false self they've worked so hard to maintain. You see, what a narcissist never wants you to realize is this: your departure impacts them far more than they'll ever show. But since their pride won't allow any vulnerability, they choose to stay silent. They opt to put on a performance. They'll twist the narrative, painting you as overly dramatic, too emotional, difficult to love. But in reality, it was you who possessed the strength to walk away, while they remain trapped behind the same mask you once saw through, and maybe even pitied. And that's the reversal. Where once they controlled the narrative, now it's your refusal to engage, your silence, your disinterest in closure that forces them to confront their most naked fear. There's no one left to manipulate, no one left to deceive, no one left to reflect back a version of themselves they can recognize. In today's video, we'll go deep into the 5 psychological stages a narcissist goes through after you walk away. Each stage reveals another piece of the mask falling away, another crack forming in the ego, and one more step toward the reality they've spent their entire life trying to outrun. And once you understand these stages, you'll come to see that leaving wasn't an act of weakness. It was the boldest, most powerful decision you could have made. Stage 1, denial. Narcissists don't engage with reality the way emotionally healthy people do. When you leave, their initial reaction isn't to feel the pain, face the consequences of their actions, or reflect on where things went wrong. Instead, they default to their most familiar defense: distortion. They immediately enter denial, the first stage of their psychological unraveling. In their world, their ego is always the focal point. No one, in their view, is strong enough to walk away from them. Rejection? That's only ever temporary. So when you finally leave, their first instinct isn't sadness, it's self-protection. They tell themselves it's just a phase. He or she will be back. They always come back. I know exactly how to pull them in again. And with that belief, they wait, but not with vulnerability or hope. Their waiting is laced with arrogance, a smug confidence that they're still in charge. They interpret your silence as strategy, not finality. To them, you're playing a game. They assume you're trying to teach them a lesson or provoke a change. And that's fine by them, because they think you'll crack eventually. During this denial phase, they do everything they can to look unbothered. They'll post cheerful pictures, go out socially, and act as if everything is under control. But this isn't genuine joy, it's a performance, crafted not just to convince others, but to convince themselves that you're not really gone. Still, denial has a shelf life. With every day that passes and you don't respond, don't show signs of breaking, don't find some excuse to come back, it starts to chip away at the illusion they're holding on to. Slowly, that confident mask begins to tear. They might start checking your social media more frequently, watching your every post and story, scanning for signs that you still care. But when they see nothing, or worse, when they see you smiling, thriving, even happy without them, that creeping sense of insecurity starts to leak through the cracks. At this point, their denial transforms. It stops being a grounded belief and becomes a panicked defense. You may receive vague, seemingly harmless messages, just checking in, "Are you okay?" or "Heard this song and thought of you." But don't be misled. These aren't sentimental, they're tests. They're checking to see if you're still vulnerable, still reachable, still under the influence of their control. If you reply, even just a little, they take it as confirmation. I still have power. But if you stay silent, they begin to slip further down the spiral toward the next stage. Still, they will fight to stretch this phase out for as long as they can. They'll tell others a version of events that suits them. A narrative where you were unstable, reactive, emotionally erratic, where they were the calm, collected one left behind with no explanation. These aren't stories told for sympathy, they're stories designed to help them preserve their fragile ego. Because if they admit to themselves that you left because of their manipulation, their indifference, their lack of empathy, then the identity they've built begins to fracture. Denial is their emotional anesthesia, a temporary numbing agent used to avoid the pain of truth. But like any drug, it eventually wears off. And when it does, when you still haven't come back, haven't taken the bait, haven't responded in any way, the withdrawal begins. It hits like emotional whiplash, restless, disoriented, angry. Your silence becomes the one thing they can't escape. It reflects back everything they've been avoiding. They've lost control. And with you, the mirror that once gave them a sense of self, now gone, they're forced to face what's left behind. And once that denial fails to keep the truth at bay, the next stage begins. The rage, the panic, the slow, silent cracking of a false identity. Stage 2, rage and panic. When denial starts to break apart, when you don't return the way they believed you would, the narcissist loses their grip on the illusion of control. Your silence becomes louder than any words, and their worst fear starts to creep in. You no longer need them. That's when their ego begins to scream. Denial gives way to rage, a furious intensity that's both loud and eerily quiet, both vindictive and rooted in identity collapse. This isn't ordinary anger. It doesn't come from heartbreak or sadness the way it might in a healthy person. This rage is born from humiliation and the deep, primal fear of losing power. To a narcissist, your silence isn't just a normal part of moving on. It's an attack. It's a threat to their control. And narcissists don't know how to lose control without trying to retaliate. You'll notice it. The messages change in tone. No longer subtle, they become sharp, laced with insults disguised as truth. I always knew you were weak. You can't handle real love. Or worse, I've found someone who actually understands me. These aren't pleas for reconnection. They're traps, provocations carefully designed to get a reaction. Because if you respond, even with anger, even just once, they take it as a sign that they still have access to you, that they still have influence. But if you don't respond, if you remain quiet, unshaken, the rage festers, it has nowhere to go. And so it begins to turn inward, twisting into chaos they can't contain. On the outside, they may still try to perform, but internally, something begins to unravel. At this stage, they often escalate. Their tactics grow more desperate. They might suddenly appear with someone new. They'll flood social media with romantic photos, affectionate captions, public declarations of joy. But don't be fooled. This isn't love. The new person isn't a partner. They're a pawn, a placeholder. A tool meant to make you feel replaceable. It's not about moving on, it's about punishing you. What's happening underneath is a war within their own psyche. They want you to suffer, but they also want you back. They want to see you jealous. But if you returned, the same old power game would resume instantly. None of it is about love. It's all driven by fear. Fear of abandonment, fear of insignificance, fear that the power they once held is now gone. This stage is especially volatile because the narcissist feels both rejected and entitled. Not only are they angry you left, they're outraged that you dared to leave on your own terms. In their world, only they get to end things. Only they control the narrative. And when you don't play along, when you don't react the way they expect, their ego is wounded on a level they can't admit. For many people who've left a narcissist, this part feels like walking through a haunted landscape. There's no visible explosion, but the air feels charged. People in your circle mention the narcissist has been asking about you. You notice strange coincidences, seeing them online at the exact moment you post something. It's subtle but persistent. They're watching, waiting, hoping you'll falter. But now you see it clearly. This isn't connection, it's strategy. And when their attempts to trigger jealousy or pain fail, when you refuse to bite the hook, something shifts. Their rage slowly begins to melt into panic. They lose the ability to predict you. You've stopped being the perfect supply. They can't provoke, can't manipulate, can't lure you back in. And that uncertainty terrifies them. The panic that follows doesn't always show up as outbursts or screaming. More often, it's quiet, but it's dangerous. That's when they may begin sabotaging your reputation. They'll spread lies to friends, to family, to colleagues. Not to vent, but to control the way others see you. They want to tarnish your image because they can't stand that you're thriving without them. Some may try a softer approach, returning as the changed version of themselves. They'll wear the mask of the good guy, the humble partner who's finally ready to do the work. But don't confuse that for real growth. It's a calculated performance, nothing more than a strategy to get you back under their influence. If pity won't work, they'll try guilt. And if that fails, they'll retreat again, only to try another tactic later. Here's something to notice during this phase. They put tremendous effort into appearing like they don't care. They work overtime to look unaffected, composed, even happy. But real detachment doesn't need an audience. The very fact that they try so hard to erase you is the clearest sign that you're still rooted deeply in their mind, possibly more than ever before. This rage won't last forever. It only continues as long as they believe they can still provoke you. Once those efforts fall flat, once they see you're no longer engaged, no longer interested, no longer accessible, the panic turns into something heavier. Something slower. Exhaustion begins to creep in. That's when they slide into the next phase, seeking a replacement. But before that, remember this. The more extreme their behavior, the more deeply your departure shook them. They didn't lose control because you meant nothing. They lost control because you were the first one who didn't come back. Stage 3. Replacement and ego reconstruction. After the storm of rage fades and all the efforts to provoke you fall flat, the narcissist finds themselves standing in a terrifying silence. Not the kind that soothes, but the kind that echoes with emptiness. It's in this hollow space they realize something deeply unsettling. Nothing they did worked. The cold silence, the carefully curated social media displays, the attempt to spark jealousy with someone new, none of it brought you back. And so they're driven toward the next phase, seeking a replacement. For most people, the end of a relationship marks the beginning of grieving, self-reflection, and growth. But not for a narcissist. They can't sit in emptiness because they lack the inner self required to anchor them through it. So instead of healing, they plunge straight into reconstruction, not of their soul, but of their image. Their identity is cracked, and now they scramble to patch it with whatever or whoever can reflect their worth back to them. The first move is always to find someone new. Quickly. No pause, no real healing, no authenticity. This new person isn't chosen from genuine connection. They're selected because they can serve a role, a mirror, an admirer, a willing participant in the narcissist's image repair. And when they find this person, the cycle restarts. The love bombing begins. They overwhelm the new partner with praise, with affection, with promises that feel intoxicating. But if it looks familiar, that's because it is. It's a performance, a copied script, a distorted remake of what they once did with you. There's a difference this time, though. Everything feels rushed, hollow, and strangely mechanical. The new partner isn't being loved, they're being used. Not as a cherished human being, but as a tool to muffle the sound of their own failure. The narcissist may try to convince themselves and the world that this new person is better than you. Easier, more supportive, more mature. But deep down, a truth lingers they don't want to face. This new person isn't you. They weren't there for the unveiling of the narcissist's real self, the brokenness, the projection, the manipulation you saw and endured. The new partner still sees the mask, not the monster beneath it. And when the narcissist senses that lack of real depth, they begin to accelerate everything. They push for milestones too soon, moving in, engagements, even marriage. But it's not born from commitment. It's desperation, a rush to lock someone in place, to prove to themselves and others that the illusion is still intact. Despite all this effort, it starts to ring hollow. The narcissist begins to compare. Maybe not out loud, but quietly, internally. They remember conversations they used to have with you that this new person doesn't understand. They remember how you confronted their darkness not by running, but by standing firm. They remember how your silence wasn't a manipulation, but a boundary, a protection of your own soul. And though the new person might be more compliant, they don't make the narcissist feel anything. At this stage, they tend to overcompensate. They'll flood social media with declarations of love, exaggerated captions, and over-the-top displays. Finally found my soulmate, or this is real love now. But it's not about love, it's about narrative control. They're trying to convince everyone else and themselves that they've moved on, that they've won. But deep within, they know it's a lie. The more they try to prove they've replaced you, the clearer it becomes that they can't. Because here's the truth. You weren't perfect, but you were real. You saw them, all of them. You loved them, not for the performance, but in spite of it. You stayed longer than you should have, not because you were weak, but because you had hope. And that kind of love? They don't forget it. Not because they appreciate it, but because it terrified them. It exposed their emptiness in a way they never wanted to see. Now, no matter how many new faces come and go, no matter how loudly they advertise their happiness, they can't recreate that feeling. That realization burns. They hate thinking about you. They bristle at how calm you seem. They're envious that your world continues without them. And somewhere in their mind, they begin to realize the truth they've been trying to outrun. They didn't just lose a partner. They lost the version of themselves that only ever existed in your presence. The one they could never maintain. The one they couldn't fake with anyone else. And that version? That was irreplaceable. No new love, no exotic trip, no designer lifestyle can rebuild what was broken when you left. And when their performance finally collapses under its own weight, when the new partner fails to fill the void when the world stops reacting, they're left with nothing but themselves. And that's the one thing they never learned how to face. Stage 4. The silent collapse. At this stage, the silence you witness from the narcissist isn't a strategy anymore. It's no longer a calculated move to bait you, to manipulate, or to feign detachment. This silence comes from a much deeper, more chaotic place. One they themselves can't even fully name. After failing to replace you, after their attempts at constructing a new narrative fall apart, and after the audience stops applauding, they enter the one realm they've avoided their entire lives, the void. But this isn't the calm, meditative kind of silence. It's not a pause for introspection. It's the kind of stillness that only exists when something has died inside, when there's nothing left to perform for. With no one around to mirror their sense of importance, no one to manipulate or control, all their tools of self-preservation begin to fall away. And what's left behind isn't peace. It's a frightening emptiness. They're face to face with their truest fear, themselves. Outwardly, they might still maintain appearances. They might show up to work, smile in photos, maybe even post an occasional inspirational quote. But if you look closely, something in their eyes has shifted. A dimming, a vacant stare that suggests something within has flickered out. What you're seeing is the beginning of an internal collapse. They've run out of emotional fuel. The supply that once sustained them, your empathy, your attention, your reactions, is gone. And now they're drifting. They feel a kind of exhaustion they can't explain. A disconnection no one around them can quite reach. A loneliness entirely of their own making. And here lies the danger. Narcissists lack the internal resources to cope with this unraveling. They never develop the emotional tools to sit with discomfort, to process grief, or to rebuild from within. So what happens now is a kind of silent self-destruction. Some will bury themselves in work, trying to stay too busy to feel. Others might chase the numbing effects of alcohol, casual sex, or partying, anything loud or intense enough to distract them from the emotional void growing inside. But with every distraction, they move further away from themselves. And the further they drift, the deeper the collapse becomes. At this point, they begin to feel a new kind of ache. Not for you exactly, but for what they felt when they were with you. They miss the feeling of being seen through your eyes, heard through your empathy, balanced by your strength. But they don't understand that what they truly miss isn't you. It's the version of themselves they were only capable of being in your presence. With you gone, they've lost both their anchor and their reflection. This pain they can't name because they've never learned the language of emotional truth. And when they can't label a feeling, they convert it into something else, often a quiet depression that no one sees. There may be no tears, no public breakdown, but the detachment is real. They disengage from life. They begin to lose interest in the things they once performed enthusiasm for. They lose energy. They start to lose their grip on the illusion. Some might begin to feel depersonalized, as if they're watching their life from outside their own body, disconnected from emotion, removed from meaning. You may not hear from them, but they may scroll through old texts, revisit songs you once loved together, or glance at photos you took. Not to mourn the relationship, but to find some fragment of themselves reflected in your gaze. But even that doesn't work anymore. Because where once your eyes reflected their humanity, now they see nothing. Not because you don't see them, but because they no longer even recognize themselves. This is when some vanish from social media completely, retreating into silence. Others do the opposite, becoming louder, more performative, more exaggerated in their efforts to appear happy. But both extremes mean the same thing: collapse. One is a shutdown, the other, a desperate final performance. They may begin to lash out at the world, not directly, but subtly. Their worldview becomes bleaker. They say things like, "No one is real, love is a scam," or "You can't trust anyone." But the truth they're avoiding is this: they no longer trust themselves. They never learned how to. Some might cling to extreme ideologies that others dive headfirst into yet another fast-moving relationship. But as you and I both know, unless they stop, unless they face themselves, all of it is just one long delay. A distraction from the full breakdown they fear more than anything. At this point, there's nothing more for you to do. You've already given more than enough. You don't need to message them, explain yourself, or offer another lifeline. You've already tried, more than once, and they refused it. Now, the only thing left for you to do is maintain your silence. Not as a punishment, but as a boundary that protects you and forces them to finally sit with the consequences of the very truth they tried to deny. If you ever question whether your absence mattered, know this: your silence has become the echo that collapses a belief system they built to protect themselves from reality. You don't need to hate them. You don't even need to forgive them yet. You only need to live, not in reaction to them, but in alignment with who you truly are. This stage won't come with drama. There will be no grand gestures or final fights, just silence. The kind of silence that isn't empty, but full. Full of truth, of reckoning, of things finally breaking apart from the inside. And that you understand, because you've lived it, and now you've survived it. Stage 5. Reconstructing the self, or complete collapse. By the time a narcissist reaches this final stage, there's nothing left for them to hold on to. No one left to project their blame onto. No source of supply, still feeding their ego. No carefully crafted mirror, reflecting back a grandiose illusion of who they once pretended to be. They are standing alone now, in a nameless void, staring into the one thing they've run from all their lives: themselves. And here, in the stillness that feels more like a free fall than a pause, they arrive at a crossroads, one that offers only two possible directions. One leads toward awakening, the other toward complete collapse. The rarer path, the one few narcissists ever choose, is the path of awakening, the dismantling of the false self they've clung to for so long. If a narcissist is ever going to change, this is the moment it might begin, when they finally admit, even if just in a whisper, "I don't know who I am anymore." This kind of ego death doesn't come with drama or rage. It arrives in silence, in a still, private breaking of the mask. If they're brave enough to move through that fracture with humility, they may begin to reach for help. Therapy, mindfulness, honest conversations with people they once dismissed. They might slowly start to explore responsibility, not as a tactic to manipulate, but as a sincere attempt to own what they've done. They may begin to understand love, not as something to extract or control, but as something to offer freely. But this path isn't common. It demands everything they've built themselves around to be undone. It means giving up their long-held defenses, admitting they were wrong, not just because things didn't work out, but because they were never taught how to be emotionally real in the first place. And for most narcissists, that level of vulnerability feels far more terrifying than collapse itself. So more often than not, they choose the other road, the familiar one. Collapse. Not dramatic or loud, but cyclical and insidious. They fall back into the only pattern they know, seeking new supply, repeating the same hollow rituals, performing the same shallow love-bombing tactics, but this time with less conviction, with less charm, with less soul. Because even they can sense that the game is starting to lose its meaning. Over time, the manipulation becomes mechanical. They go through the motions not because they believe in them, but because they don't know any other way to feel alive. It's not strategy anymore. It's habit, desperate habit. And with each cycle, they become more fragmented, less tethered to any real emotional experience. What once was a performance full of fire has now become a lifeless script, recycled and drained of its original force. Some narcissists at this stage begin to present themselves as especially polished, even morally superior, what psychologists refer to as covert or communal narcissists. They say all the right things, appear deeply compassionate, and project a sense of integrity. But behind the curtain they feel nothing. No real joy, no grief, no intimacy. Just the ghost of someone they once pretended to be, with a hollow center that not even the most devoted partner can reach. Others become colder, harsher, even dangerous, because they've hit the point where they no longer have anything to lose. The manipulations continue, not because they want power, but because it's the only act they have left. It's the only way they know how to feel like they still exist, even if it means hurting others. Especially then, because pain, even inflicted on someone else, is still a form of feeling. And for you, the one who once loved them, who tried to see the good, who hoped things could change, this is when you must embrace a painful truth. You cannot save them. You were never meant to. You gave chances. You offered grace. You extended patience beyond your own limits. But healing, real healing, can't be borrowed from another person. It has to come from within. And if they aren't willing to reach into that space of truth, no amount of love will pull them out. If they fully collapse, if they spiral into a self-destructive cycle they can't escape, that is not your failure. It's not your burden. It's the natural result of 1,000 denied truths. Truths you once tried to share, gently, honestly, in the hope of connection. And if they ever do think of you in that final silence, it won't be with blame or even longing. It will be in a rare moment of clarity, when they realize the only person who ever truly saw them, loved them without demand, and still chose to walk away, was you. That is the mark you leave behind. Not destruction, but truth. Not bitterness, but a kind of love they were never strong enough to honor. And now, even though they're unraveling, you are not. You are rising. You have become someone who no longer needs closure to feel whole. You've stopped seeking apology to feel peace. You don't need to witness their downfall to validate your choice. You only need one thing: to keep moving forward, to walk ahead without turning back. Because your story didn't end when you left. It began. The path ahead is yours now, and it is wide open. And if you're still healing, still feeling, still finding your way back to your voice, know this: you're doing beautifully. You are stronger than they ever gave you credit for, and far more powerful than the version of you they tried to reduce. Let their collapse be their own. You don't need to carry it anymore. What are your views on this? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I will personally read all of your comments. And if you seriously want to level up in life, don't forget to show some love by hitting the like and subscribe button. Stay strong. Until next time.